Who will guard the guardians? I mean, if the police are sufficiently independent, that's fine. But of course, there's always a possibility that the police are involved in various criminal activities. They're human beings. They're involved. They're mixed with powerful people. The temptation to go along with criminal activity, especially if it's coming from the top, is always going to be there. Okay. And therefore, there's got to be some kind of trust built up.
Okay, Martin and Kevin Phillips, Chairman of Avon and Somerset Police Federation, thanks very much for joining us. And we're going to hear now from Tim Tate. He is actually a documentary maker that lives in the southwest of England, and he tells the story of how his documentary on Republican child sexual abuse was made and then closed down, and how the victims ended up dead or doing decades in jail, while many of the US right-wing politicians just carried on in their political careers.
I'm Tim Tate. I'm a documentary filmmaker, investigative journalist and author of books. And I've been doing this for 30-something years for all British television networks and American networks, Al Jazeera, and books for a variety of publishers.
Can you just give us an idea of some of the films you've made that people might recognise, or books?
I worked with Roger Cook for 8 years, both in BBC Radio and then ITV's Cook Report. So people might recognise some of those. I've made films for Al Jazeera International, which I think probably has a footprint of about 250 million, so some people have seen those. It's investigative filmmaking, that's what I do. The last thing I made for Jazeera was an 8-part investigative series on 21st century slavery. So we were literally filming all around the world, investigating slavery. Genuine slaves, people who are forced to work, get no pay and aren't allowed to leave, and there are 27 million of them in the world today.
Well, I've come to you today to talk particularly about this film, Conspiracy of Silence. Tell us what that film was about and how you came to make it.
The film tells the story of the alleged prostitution of young people, teenagers, firstly from America's favourite charity, Boys Town, which some people will remember from the Hollywood movies with Spencer Tracy. Boys Town is a real place in Nebraska. A freelance journalist with whom I'd worked brought me the story, allegations that children from Boys Town were being prostituted by a senior business and political figure in Nebraska, and further that he had prostituted those children, both from Boys Town and from across Nebraska. He'd taken them to be abused by people all over the states, and particularly in Washington, D.C., at what were described as parties with senior political figures.
So what was Boys Town?
Boys Town it's a town. It's an incorporated town in Nebraska. It was originally set up for homeless, impoverished or endangered children in the 1920s, I think, certainly 20s or early 30s. And it was a caring community. It was set up by the church, by a priest. And its aim was to protect and to nurture and to help children in very difficult circumstances. And it has grown and grown and grown, so that, as I say, it is an incorporated town under American law. I think it has its own stamps now as well. It's a charity, and it has been described, and I believe it is, America's favourite charity. The problem was that in the 80s, this very powerful, influential figure, a man called Lawrence King, wormed his way into Boys Town and allegedly began prostituting children from it.
So what did you discover as part of the documentary? You say connections with Washington, D.C., but was it any specific party, any specific people in the main political parties in the US?
That's going to be a complicated answer. There were two waves of allegations. The first happened in the late 1980s, when young people from Boys Town broke cover and made their allegations. By the time I got to the story, it was 3 or 4 years later, and those complainants had disappeared. I spent an awful long time trying to find them, and they had simply disappeared off the face of the earth. There was a second wave of allegations which had happened about a year previously, but from young people, 3 young people in particular, from Nebraska, not from Boys Town, but who had been involved with the prostitution of children from Boys Town as well as from the streets in Nebraska. And what they described were child sex parties throughout Nebraska, but primarily in Omaha, and they also described being flown to Washington, D.C. to be abused at parties on what is known as Embassy Row, in houses along Embassy Row in Washington, D.C. So we're talking, and they were able to identify these houses to us, very wealthy, a very wealthy bit of real estate. They described politicians being present. In one case, there was an allegation of one of the most senior and famous American politicians of the time being present while a young boy was sexually abused. These 3 young people made their allegations. They made them first to the police and also to a commission of inquiry from the Nebraska State Senate, state government. What happened to those allegations and what happened to those young people was simply disgraceful.
So, what was the motive behind it then?
Behind the sexual abuse? What's the motive behind any sexual abuse?
Well, we were talking about this at the very highest political levels, though. So, this does start to look like more like there is some kind of political motive, possibly.
I think you have to be a bit careful with that. What they were primarily describing was the sexual abuse of teenagers within rich and powerful circles in Nebraska. That happened to involve Nebraskan politicians, but local politicians, them being flown to Washington to take part in child sex or teenage sex parties in Washington, D.C. What was the motive? The presumed motive, or rather what they presumed one of the motives was for them being at those parties in Washington, D.C., was that it gave Lawrence King a great deal of leverage. This was almost exclusively within the Republican Party. Lawrence King was a rising star. He was the rising black star in the Republican Party at the time, and in fact sang the national anthem at the Republican National Convention, which is a huge honour for any aspiring politician.
Are there any senior politicians that were named as part of this investigation? Yeah,
absolutely. I'm not going to name them because we didn't name the most senior ones in the film, because to do so we would have required a great deal more than the evidence we had. But the victims of this abuse, and I think there's little question but that they were abused, gave evidence in secret to a grand jury. Grand jury testimony is secret, and indeed they also gave it in secret to a state Senate inquiry. I happened to get access to all of those files and read the names that they testified to. Without question, that should have led to a full investigation by the FBI. One of the things I found most disturbing, and my colleagues found most disturbing, is that rather than investigate, what the FBI was very plainly doing was trying to close the whole thing down.
You mentioned that some of the witnesses disappeared and the victims disappeared, and you found some other ones. It does sort of imply that there's some threats and attempts to close down the investigation one way or another. Did you notice when you were making the documentary, did you find there was any attempt to intimidate you out of doing it, that sort of thing?
Yeah, without question. We were followed by what we believed and were led to believe was the FBI. Our cars were followed. Now, I think if anyone who knows anything about this knows that if you're being followed professionally, you're not going to know about it. Someone was, I think, quite clearly trying to send us a message that we were not welcome in Nebraska. We were there. I was there for a total of 3 months dealing with this. And it was made very plain that we were under observation. No one ever threatened me, for which I'm very glad. That said, some of the witnesses were absolutely intimidated. 2 in particular. From the first wave, there was a young woman, very young woman, early mid-teens, and by the time I tracked her down, and she was one I did track down 3 or 4 years later. She was mid to late teens. It took an awful long time to find her. When I did find her, I literally turned up at her doorstep one evening. She confirmed who she was. She said, yes, she knew what I was talking about, but she was looking around constant. She was very, very plainly frightened, and said, would I come back the next day? By the time I got back the next day, the house was empty. I never found her again. From the second wave, there was a young man called Troy Bonner, and if people see the film, they will see him in it. Troy had made allegations and had corroborated the allegations of the 2 other main complainants. Troy was a troubled young man. He had a serious drug problem, which had not been helped by his involvement in child sex parties. When I found him, he was terrified. He had originally given his evidence. He had then been threatened, so he said, by the FBI to withdraw that evidence, and had recanted. So by the time I found him, he was in a pretty tricky state. And I wasn't about to take his word for it that he had been threatened by the FBI or pressured by the FBI, but I found an audio recording in these files which were locked up and kept secret. I found an audio recording made by the FBI in which the FBI introduced themselves. It's an audio recording of Troy ringing up one of the other complainants and trying to get her to admit that she had made up the story. She was incredulous and saying, what are you talking about? Why are you doing this? And Troy, in this recorded phone call, was just about losing it, saying, I can't tell you, you just got to say this didn't happen. And at one point she says, is there someone there with you? Are the police there with you? No. No, at the very front of the recording, the police, the FBI, had introduced themselves. This is a recording made by the FBI with Troy Bonner. He was terrified, and he said he'd been threatened by the FBI that if he didn't recant, he would go to prison. As a very severe drug addict, he was worried by that. I spent weeks with Troy, and I persuaded him in the end that it would be better if he told the truth, and that once he'd told the truth, there was no mileage in anyone doing anything to him. And he did. He agreed, and he recanted his recantation and told the truth about all of it on film. And my promise to him had been that once you've done that, and once the film's broadcast, you'll be safe. The film, as people may know, was never broadcast. Troy disappeared, and a year later he was found dead.
Well, there's echoes there of the recordings made by Liz McKean for Newsnight of the victims of Jimmy Savile. She went back to her boss, I think it's Peter Rippon at Newsnight, the BBC here in Britain, and she was told, well, there's a Jimmy Savile special coming up at Christmas, and I'm afraid we won't be able to broadcast. So how does that affect you as a programme maker when you, after, maybe days, weeks, months even of getting someone to go on camera, you're then told by your bosses and the people that own the transmitters and that kind of thing that, oh, we're never going to show this?
I felt then, and I still feel now, at least partially responsible for Troy's death. Troy's death was, as I understand it, the result of a drug overdose. That in itself is no great surprise. He was, as he made plain, addicted to heroin and crack. He also said that if things went wrong, he would be found dead of a drug overdose and it wouldn't be him. Was it him? Did he accidentally take an overdose? Did he commit suicide, or was it something else? I don't know, but I do know that the reassurance I had given him, and which persuaded him to tell the truth, didn't happen.
So what have you learnt since you made that documentary, and what's happened to some of the victims and some of the perpetrators of abuse in Omaha?
I think it's probably worth rehearsing what happened to the film. The film was... I was then working for Yorkshire Television's documentaries department, which was the best place in Britain and probably the world to make serious documentaries, to make serious films. Yorkshire Television had done a deal with Discovery, the US and European-based cable company, for a series of to make a series of documentaries on its, which would be broadcast on Discovery. And Discovery had leapt at the proposal for our film, Conspiracy of Silence. I can remember the commissioning editor rubbing her hands and saying, it's got everything. It's got politics, it's got paedophilia, it's got everything we want. And they gave us the money to go and make it. And we spent, as I say, I spent 3 months in Nebraska, on and off, and other places, making this film. Everything was shot on 16mm film, which is a phenomenally expensive way of making documentaries. And we brought all the material back to Britain, to Yorkshire, to cut the film. And we assembled a rough cut of the film, which is the normal way of doing things. And that rough cut, my colleague, who was the director, I was the producer, my colleague took that rough cut over to Washington, D.C. to show it, as you would normally do, to Discovery, who were paying for it. In the meantime, my job was to show it to the lawyers and to work with the lawyers to get it into a shape where it was okay, legally okay to transmit it. Yorkshire Television, under its contract with Discovery, had legal responsibility for doing that. It was our responsibility to get a legal clean bill of health for the film so it could be broadcast. And we had very good lawyers, media lawyers in London, Goodman Derrick, and a very high-powered firm of media lawyers in New York. They went over it, and I showed them the evidence, and both sets of lawyers gave the film a clean bill of health. It was good to go legally. By the time that had happened, Nick, my colleague, the director, had had his meeting with Discovery, who liked the rough cut, but who then, subsequently, turned round and cancelled the film. And I remember, to this day, him ringing me, Nick, my colleague, ringing me, and shell-shocked, saying, I've just come out of a meeting, they say they won't broadcast the film. And I asked what the reason was, and this was what he was told, and I quote, We seem to have gotten into an investigative area which is inconsistent with Discovery's mission statement. Now, you read into that whatever you want to read into that. But Discovery was adamant. I mean, the film was actually in the listings, television listings magazines. It was scheduled. They simply pulled out. They refused to discuss it any further. Eventually, the film was handed back to Yorkshire Television. The rights to it were handed back to Yorkshire Television, with Discovery paying all the substantial costs of making it to date, and Yorkshire given the right to do whatever it wanted to do with it, to get it broadcast elsewhere if it wanted to, on the condition that no one ever associated Discovery with the film.
Now, that's interesting, because surely it would have made sense for Yorkshire to get it broadcast in Britain.
Yeah, I thought that. We were, as you might imagine, pretty shell-shocked, but I began trying to find alternative networks to broadcast this. And in fact, I had a couple of approaches from distributors who wanted to fund the remaining work, and it didn't. I mean, it needed to be finished. It was a rough cut, and to broadcast it or to blow it up to 35mm for a cinema feature documentary. The man who was then running the documentaries department at Yorkshire Television just didn't want to know.
Well, what's your thoughts about what was behind that then? And I wonder if anybody who was from Discovery or from the networks here in Britain, because, I mean, it did touch on some very key and very powerful politicians, didn't it? I mean, one would like to think that they are, that one would like to think that they're not actually above the law and not above having documentaries made about them, these key political figures.
I think there are a number of answers to that. The film was exclusively American. It was about a situation, a case, a series of allegations, a scandal in the United States. There was no part of the film which touched on Britain. British networks, would they now have been interested? My guess is probably not. They tend to be quite parochial, and they're not really interested in films which don't have a British angle. This didn't. This was specifically an American film. And in the rest of the United States, I can't think of a single US network, be it cable, be it mainstream television, which would go near this. They don't want to do investigative journalism. But
why not? I mean, I'm a bit annoyed because you've done all your work. You've found out that it's legally okay to show. At least, that's what the lawyers are indicating. So how does it work that, powerful people get programs like this, as it seems, shut down?
That's a very good question. And if I knew the answer to that, possibly I wouldn't be making films, but I would be a politician. I simply don't know the answer. What I can tell you is that Lawrence King, the central figure in this, the man about whom most of the allegations were made and on whom they centred, went to prison for 15 years for fraud. He was unquestionably a fraudster, amongst other things. But if you contrast that with what happened to one of the victims, a young woman called Alicia Owens, she'd been in the second wave. By the time I arrived, Alicia had been hung out to dry by the courts in Nebraska. She had been required in court testimony to name her abusers. She had done so, and she was thereafter prosecuted for perjury, and she was given a sentence of between 9 and 27 years in prison for naming her abuser. Firstly, that's a tell to me. That's an enormous sentence for perjury. But what was even more worrying was she was tried in Nebraska state court in Nebraska, and under Nebraska state law, and Nebraska law specifically provided not just protection for naming your alleged abuser, but actually made it a legal requirement. So Alicia was jailed for this huge sentence under a law which didn't exist.
We've had recently the Jimmy Savile scandal, which actually in some ways many people think may never have seen the light of day if it hadn't been for some dogged attempts to get that story out. And I just wonder if you think the child sexual abuse inquiry that's currently going on, at least there's an attempt to get this child sexual abuse inquiry done by the Home Office, whether you think that we're ever going to get to the bottom of that when we don't have this backstop of the investigative documentaries. Can we really rely on statutory bodies like the Home Office, the courts, to get to the bottom of what really went on?
No, is the simple answer. For my sins or otherwise, I have spent 25 years making films and writing books about what adults do to children, primarily child sexual abuse, and the loose, disorganized networks of paedophiles. And there are men who have been to prison because of the work that I was funded to do. But I've worked with a number of police units and departments over the years. All of them have told and continue to tell exactly the same story. We are not given enough resources to do this job. We don't have the manpower. We don't have the trained officers. And the decision not to give them that is a political decision with a small p. Someone has said this is not sufficiently a priority. Two small examples. I made a film and wrote a book with a man called Ray Wire, who was then the best expert at dealing with men who abuse children. And it was about what was then Britain's worst child sex serial killer, who's serving a succession of life sentences now. He should have been picked up long before he was. No one had bothered communicating to anybody else his records. But most worryingly, when I went to what was then called the National Criminal Intelligence Service, which has now been superseded by the National Crime Agency, Britain's FBI, effectively, 2 years after he was sentenced, his name was not on their database. And there was a reason for that. And the reason for that was that they had been assigned, NSIS had been assigned 1.5 officers to work on child sexual abuse, paedophile intelligence, whilst in the next office there were 11 officers doing exactly the same job for football hooliganism. Somebody has said football hooliganism is a priority, child sexual abuse isn't. All right, that's 15, 20 years ago. Has it changed? No, it hasn't. I wrote a story for one of the Nationals earlier on this year about a man who had been arrested in Lancashire. The National Crime Agency had been tipped off by the Russian Interior Ministry that this man was trading child pornography via a Russian-based peer-to-peer network. It was a fantastic piece of cooperation from the Russian Interior Ministry. The National Crime Agency farmed this investigation out to Lancashire Police, where the man lived. They raided him. They couldn't find the film he had been trading, but they found other material. one of which was, according to the police, according to the prosecution in the subsequent trial, and according to the judge in that trial, the first snuff child pornography film that had ever been seized. It was a teenage girl shown being sexually abused, tied up and suffocated, and then lying dead. Her face and the offender's face were quite visible on this film. That film was seized a year, 16 months before I got involved in the case. It should have been sent by Lancashire Police to the National Crime Agency, who should have checked with their facial recognition software. They are under an international treaty, binding international treaty, to send that material to law enforcement worldwide, particularly to the United States, which has the best facial recognition software, and particularly because the girl, the victim, and the perpetrator in this were American. They had American accents. 16 months after that tape was seized, it was still sitting in Lancashire Police. No one had done anything with it. We don't assign a priority to this. It doesn't matter, apparently. I think it matters. And I do not understand why we don't do this properly.
Well, don't you think there's a sort of psychology around this, that because it's something that people recoil from, and they will maybe switch the TV off if they see something like this on the TV? It's actually something which actually aids the perpetrators. That
documentaries about child sexual abuse, and indeed books about them, are some of the hardest things ever to get commissioned. And it is true that a significant number of people will refuse to watch. I think that's asking the wrong question. I don't really mind if 100 people watch this or 1 million people watch this. Our job is to do the work and to show it, and somehow to get as many people as will watch it, to watch it. But more than that, doing what we do is the essential watchdog on the police, on the government, on the courts. If we don't, as journalists, be the dog that barks, who the hell will?
Now you owe me one. And if you don't pay me when you owe me, then I'm going to pay you what you owe me. You see what I'm saying?